We've come now to the final chapter in the book Animal Magnetism by William Lang, and this will be followed by a supplement also. There's a lot of very weird things coming up in this chapter. The book is going out with a bang, so let's get going. Chapter 8. We come now to a record of cases still more extraordinary than any we have yet given, but which are attested in the strongest manner by the most reputable and trustworthy witnesses. We are indebted to Mr. Colhoun's excellent work on magnetism for these wonderful facts. Dr. Arndt, an eminent German physician, relates that being one day seated near the bed of one of his somnambulists, on a sudden she became agitated, uttered sighs as if tormented by some vision, and exclaimed, "O heavens, my father! He is dying." A few moments afterwards she awoke, seemed quite cheerful, and recollected nothing of the anxiety she had so recently manifested. She again relapsed twice into the same state of magnetic sleep, and each time was tormented by the same vision. Being asked what had happened to her father, she answered, "He is bathed in blood. He is dying." Soon afterwards she awoke, became composed, and the scene finished. Some weeks afterwards, Dr. Arndt found this lady pensive and sorrowful. She had just received from her father, who was at the distance of some 100 miles, an account of a serious accident which had befallen him. In ascending the stair of his cellar, the door had fallen upon his breast, considerable hemorrhage ensued, and the physicians despaired of his life. Dr. Arndt, who had marked the precise time of the preceding scene during the somnambulism of the lady, found it was the same day and hour as the accident had happened to her father. Mademoiselle W., being at the house of Monsieur du R., predicted respecting his son that he was wounded in the chin in Russia and under treatment in the hospital, which proved to be the fact. On the arrival of the list of wounded, the son's name was not included, at which the father was delighted, and stated to Mademoiselle W., who was at that time in somnambulic sleep, that for once she had not guessed accurately, and had been completely deceived. At this she was very much offended, and in an angry tone assured the father that she was quite certain of the truth of what she said, that at that very moment she saw his son in the hospital with a white linen round his chin. Soon afterwards a note arrived, stating that a second list of wounded had been received, in which was the name of the son, who had been struck by a musket ball in the chin and was under treatment in the hospital. 2 persons, while in somnambulism, predicted the death of the King of Württemberg. The prediction of the first somnambulist, in which the year and month were announced, occurred 4 years before the event. The circumstance was kept secret among a few friends, and from the length of time that had elapsed had been nearly forgotten when it was unexpectedly confirmed by a second somnambulist, who announced not only the year and month, but also the precise day. The first prediction, which was made by Mademoiselle W., of whose powers mention has been made in the preceding case, took place in 1812, in the presence of several persons, that His Majesty would die in an unusual manner between the 18th and 20th April 1816. When questioned in subsequent crises respecting the accuracy of this announcement, she said she was quite certain as to the year, but might be mistaken as to the particular month. At a subsequent period she fixed upon the month of October without specifying any particular day. The second prediction was made by a somnambulist upon the 17th April 1816 in the presence of 3 persons, and was to the following effect. His Majesty will die this year, in the month of October. When asked whether the event would take place in the beginning, the middle, or the end of the month, she answered, "At the end." "Can you determine the precise day? Will it be the 26th? "No, the 28th. On that day he will be struck with apoplexy." The king was actually struck with apoplexy on the day predicted, and died in the course of a day or 2 after. And there's a slight footnote here. Another remarkable instance is adduced in Captain Medwin's Memoirs of Shelley. This report was drawn up by Professor Eschenmayer and inserted in the first volume of the German archives of animal magnetism. It is attested by the names of 9 well-known individuals, medical men, and other persons of respectability, and the professor declares that, if necessary, he could adduce 200 witnesses to prove the truth of the facts. And here is a longer footnote. A few days ago, says Dr. Edwin Lee in his work on animal magnetism, London, J. Churchill, 1843, I met with a German gentleman who, when at Stuttgart, made particular inquiries respecting the above event, which he ascertained to be as stated, and the coincidence of the occurrence with the prediction is not doubted by the inhabitants. The same gentleman stated to me that Niebuhr, the historian, being with his son at an inn, called to him in the night and told him he must expect to hear of the death of his uncle, which had just taken place. This proved to be true, the uncle, who was at a distance and previously in good health, having been taken suddenly ill and died at the time specified. That was the footnote. The following facts are extracted from the work of Monsieur Chardel, who treats of animal magnetism incidentally as connected with the psychological science, and who, moreover, speaks from personal knowledge of the facts he relates. Monsieur Chardel had 2 sisters as his patients, who were both magnetic somnambulists and in the most intimate rapport with each other. Monsieur Chardel proposed to bleed the elder of these 2 sisters in the foot. In the meantime, the younger sister, after being magnetized, felt somewhat indisposed and went to bed in another room. The father and mother remained to assist the operator. At the first attempt to insert the lancet, a piercing cry was heard to proceed from the bedroom of the younger sister, who, on entering it, was found to be in a swoon, in the position in which she had gone to sleep. Monsieur Chardel recovered her, and inquired the cause of her fainting. She then related the details of all his movements in the projected operation. She said that she had constantly followed him with her eyes, and that at the moment he was going to insert the lancet, an emotion which she could not control had entirely deprived her of sense. In the case of ordinary life, this would have been impossible, considering the distance and the intervening walls. The same author mentions the following anecdote upon the authority of a gentleman of distinction and credit. The wife of this gentleman had a femme de chambre in a very weak state of health. She magnetized her and placed her in a state of somnambulism. The lady was assisted by her husband. One day, when the magnetic sitting was accompanied with some considerable pains, the patient asked for some old wine. The husband took a candle and went down to the cellar in search of it. He descended the first flight of steps without any accident, but the cellar being situated pretty far underground, the steps in the lower part were wet. He slipped upon the stair and fell backwards, but without hurting himself, and even without extinguishing the light which he held in his hand. When he returned with the wine, he found that his wife was informed of his fall, and of all the particulars of his subterranean journey, the somnambulist having related them to her exactly as they happened. Monsieur Chardel says that he could adduce several other instances within his personal knowledge of a similar degree of clairvoyance, having been manifested at much greater distances. The same respectable author mentions that he knew the wife of a colonel of a cavalry regiment who was magnetized by her husband and became somnambulic. Having himself become indisposed, he was obliged to call in to his assistance for 8 or 10 days an officer of the same regiment. At a magnetic sitting subsequent to this, the husband, having placed his wife in a state of somnambulism, called her attention to this officer. "Ah, the wretched man!" she exclaimed. "I see him. He is at blank. He is going to kill himself. He has a pistol in his hand. Run, run!" The place was about a league distant. The husband mounted his horse and made all the haste he could, but he arrived too late. This lady, whose name was Madame Planton, had a married daughter, Madame Legendre, who resided in the country and was unable to repair to Paris until some days after the operation had been performed upon her mother. Madame Legendre, having been magnetized, became somnambulic and manifested a very remarkable degree of lucidity. It was proposed to consult her upon the state of her mother, and for this purpose Dr. Chapelain magnetized her on the 26th of April and questioned her on the subject. She answered by giving a circumstantial and accurate description of her mother's complaints and predicting her death in the course of 2 days, in spite of all that could be done for her. On the following day, Dr. Chapelain, upon visiting his patient, Madame Planton, found that the melancholy prediction of the somnambulist was about to be verified. She was evidently much worse. Monsieur Cloquet requested Dr. Chapelain to place Madame Legendre in a state of somnambulism and put several questions to her relative, to Madame Planton. She answered that her mother had become very weak during the last few days, that her life was only artificially prolonged by magnetism, and that, notwithstanding every effort, she would die next morning early, without pain. When asked what were the parts diseased, she gave, as will be afterwards seen, a correct description of them. Monsieur Chapelain magnetized Madame Planton several times with great energy during the course of the day, and could scarcely succeed in setting her asleep. When he returned next morning about 7 o'clock, the patient had just expired. The two doctors were very naturally anxious to verify the declarations of the somnambulist relative to the internal state of the body, and obtained the consent of the family to examine it. Monsieur Moreau, secretary to the surgical section of the Academy, and Dr. Dronsart were requested to attend as witnesses, and it was resolved that the examination should take place next day in their presence. It was conducted by Monsieur Cloquet and his assistant, Monsieur Paillou. Dr. Chapelain was also present. The latter set Madame Legendre asleep a short time before the hour fixed upon for the operation. The medical gentleman then requested to know from her own mouth what she had previously said she had seen in the interior of the body of Madame Planton, when the somnambulist repeated in a firm tone of voice and without hesitation what she had formerly announced to Messieurs Cloquet and Chapelain. The latter then conducted her to the room adjoining that in which the operation was to be performed, and of which the door was exactly shut. Madame Legendre was still in a state of somnambulism, and in spite of the barriers which separated her from these gentlemen, she followed the bistoury in the hands of the operator, and said to the persons around her, "Why do they make the incision in the middle of the breast, seeing that the effusion is in the right side?" The indications given by the somnambulist were found to be quite correct. The procès-verbal of the examination was drawn up by Dr. Dronsart, attested and signed by all the persons present, and inserted at length in the work of Monsieur Chardel. In the German Annals of Medicine, Jahrbucher der Medizin, the celebrated philosopher Schelling relates the following case, which occurred under his own observation. In a crisis of clairvoyance, Miss M, having previously been quite cheerful, began all at once to assume an appearance of anxiety and sorrow, and at last fell a-weeping. When I asked her what was the matter, she answered that she had just then become aware that a death had recently taken place in the family, at the distance of more than 150 leagues. I endeavored to dissuade her from entertaining such thoughts, but in vain. She insisted that she was quite certain of the fact, and continued to weep. Wishing to ascertain how she had come by this intelligence, she said she herself did not well know, but that she had at once become quite certain of it. I asked her whether she could name the person who had died. She said she could not at that time, but should be able to do so in a future crisis. She added that the letter containing the intelligence was then upon its way. She conjured me to say nothing about this presentiment after the crisis, otherwise it would give her mortal anxiety. It is well known, says the professor, that somnambulists, when they awake out of the magnetic sleep, have not the slightest recollection of what may have taken place in it. When she awoke out of her sleep, Miss M was as cheerful as ever, and had not the most distant idea of her vision. The expression of pain she exhibited during the crisis, which seemed to proceed so entirely from an internal conviction of the reality of the fact, and the obstinacy with which she adhered to her assertion of its truth, induced me to give her credit. I mentioned the case to Professor Schmid, in order that he might be a witness to the fact. I awaited with great anxiety the hour when I could again set my somnambulist asleep, in order to ascertain whether she would again have the same vision. For a considerable period during the crisis, nothing of the kind appeared. She was, as usual, quite cheerful, and spoke a great deal, until all at once marks of sorrow were exhibited in her countenance. She turned away her face, and hid it on her arm, which she had placed on the arm of her chair, and wept in silence. At length I asked what ailed her. "The same as yesterday," she answered. "A death has taken place in our family. I know it for certain." She thought it fortunate for her that she knew nothing of this when awake, because it would occasion her so much grief. I again asked her whether she did not also know the individual who was dead, and she repeated that she would be able to tell me in a future crisis, provided I put the question to her. In the following crisis, as soon as she was set asleep, she again began to weep. She requested me to use every means of diverting her attention from this circumstance during her sleep, and I endeavored to do so by introducing other subjects of conversation, yet she frequently reverted to it. Had I foreseen the circumstances which subsequently made it impossible for me to place her more frequently in a state of crisis, I should, upon the last occasion, instead of diverting her thoughts from the subject in question, rather have endeavored to ascertain whether she could give any farther particulars of the event. But I neglected the opportunity, and reserved my questions for future crises, which could no longer take place. 4 or 5 days after the last sitting, upon entering her apartment, I found Miss M. much downcast, with appearances on her countenance indicating that she had been weeping. On inquiring into the reason of this, she pointed to a letter which lay upon the table, and said it contained intelligence of the death of a near relative and particular friend. I asked her whether she had received any previous accounts of the indisposition of this individual. She answered, "No, none at all. The intelligence came upon me quite unexpectedly." Nor was she at all aware of any presentiment she had of the event. Such is a brief outline of some of the more surprising phenomena recorded and attested by numerous witnesses. And if it be admitted that any one of the facts stated did occur, we are scarcely justified in refusing credence to the others which have been related, of which the only rational explanation appears to me to be that, under circumstances, the immaterial principle, the soul, may be temporarily loosed from the bodily organization. For as the sense of sight does not reside in the eye, nor that of touch in the hand, these parts being merely the organs by means of which the manifestation of the faculties is made evident, it is not unreasonable to infer that the organs are not under all circumstances indispensable for perception. Admitting this to be the case, it is no more impossible than an unknown individual many miles distant should be described, than that a card in an adjoining room should be named by persons in whom these exceptionable conditions exist, space being, as Dr. Jung-Stelling has observed, merely the operations of the material organs of sense. Out of them has no existence. Therefore, as soon as the soul forsakes the latter, all proximity and distance cease. Hence, if it stand in rapport with a person many thousand miles distant from it, it can impart knowledge by an internal communication, and receive it from such an one, and all this as rapidly as thoughts follow each other. Time being also, in fact, a mere mode of thinking, and not existing in reality, the departed soul may be susceptible of future things. In the words of Epicharmus, the mind sees, the mind hears, everything else is deaf and blind. If the phenomena observed are calculated to excite our wonder and to call forth our skepticism, if they appear to be inexplicable and irreconcilable with any of our previous notions, let us remember that the cause of this may be found in the narrowness and imperfection of our preconceived systems, and this consideration should lead us to a careful review of the principles of our knowledge, rather than to an obstinate and irrational denial of the facts presented to us by experience. The materialists themselves, says Colhoun, seem to be perfectly aware of the deficiencies of their own systems, and in order to supply a remedy, they are compelled to call into their aid the auxiliary assistance of two foreign principles. With their matter, they associate mechanism, which implies design, and must therefore be a product of mind or intelligence, and postulate motion, the nature of which is directly opposite to that of matter. And they afterwards resort to a variety of gratuitous hypotheses in order to enable them to explain the reciprocal action of these elements in a manner corresponding with the phenomena of the vital functions. They might truly exclaim with the sacred writer, Ambulavimus vias difficile, et eravimus a via veritatis. For, after all their expenditure of labor and ingenuity, they find it wholly impossible to account for intellect and the moral manifestations upon their favorite principles, and at last they only exhibit to view a fanciful, fantastic, and frightful monster, like the Caliban creature of the modern Prometheus, whose uncouth form and awkward movements are calculated to excite the disgust or the risibility of the rational philosopher. The animal magnetist, on the other hand, takes a more simple, a more discriminating, and at the same time a more comprehensive view of nature. He distinguishes, as authorized by the facts presented to his notice, between the materiality and the motion of bodies, and the spiritual principle which animates and actuates organized beings. And he considers the phenomena manifested by the latter as infinitely more important to the philosophy of man than those of the former. He is not content to examine the fleshless skeleton in order to acquire a knowledge of the principles of life and action, or to pore over the sapless trunk with a view to discover the causes of the germination of the bud, or the gradual growth and ultimate maturity of the fruit. His business does not lie among the tombs and the charnel houses, the abodes of decay and corruption. In the true spirit of the inductive philosophy, he cautiously interrogates living nature, receives her answers with humility, and treasures them up with faith and confidence, as infinitely more edifying and useful than the most profuse ingenuity of perverse speculation. And he is so much the more assured of the reality and the solidity of the knowledge he has thus acquired, because it ultimately rests upon a firm and insubvertible foundation of facts presented by nature herself, and discards the feeble, precarious, and unsatisfactory support of unsubstantial and unstable hypotheses. He is thus enabled to give a simple and sufficient philosophical reason for the faith which is in him, while his whole doctrine is calculated to elevate humanity and to dignify by spiritualizing science. In short, in the phenomena manifested in the higher degrees of animal magnetism, we may find a complete, practical refutation of all the material theories of the human mind, a most distinct, cogent, and impressive proof of the independent existence of the soul of man, and, consequently, the strongest philosophical grounds for presuming its immortality, since it has now been demonstrated beyond the possibility of rational doubt that, in its manifestations, it is not necessarily chained down to any particular part of the sensible and mortal body, but that it is capable of exercising its various functions in peculiar circumstances without the assistance or cooperation of any of those material organs, by means of which it usually maintains a correspondence with the external world. Now there are two long footnotes right next to each other. I am going to read them both. The first one says, Dr. Georget, a young and most promising physician, and also a member of the Institute or Royal Academy of Sciences at Paris, published a work of great merit in 1821 under the title of Physiologie du Système Nerveux, in which he broadly professed the principles of materialism, but afterwards, on becoming acquainted with the phenomena of the magnetic somnambulism, he found reason to change his opinions, and in his last will and testament Dated 1st March 1826, he earnestly requested that the utmost publicity might be given to his recantation. According to Mr. Colquhoun, the study of the phenomena of animal magnetism has lately done wonders in France by weaning many from the deadly errors of materialism and infidelity, and giving birth to a sound spiritual and religious faith. The second footnote says, the phenomena of animal magnetism are facts which can no more be doubted than can the reality of those meteoric stones which occasionally fall from the heavens. If there be any bridge, any connection between this and the other world, any transition from the temporary life of the soul to the eternal life of the spirit, these phenomena must be capable of giving us some insight into the subject. They deserve, therefore, in despite of all danger or deception, our most serious attention, as it would be equally foolish, in the face of such amply attested experience, to deliver ourselves over to an all-denying skepticism, as to resign ourselves to a blind faith in the case of every alleged phenomenon. Somnambulism affords us, at least, in its already admitted facts, the incontestable proof that higher powers reside in man, which stretch beyond the narrow sphere of the rude sensual existence, and transcend the horizon of the human understanding, entangled in its abstractions. C.J. Eisenlohr, Privy Councillor to the Grand Duke of Baden, etc., Irene, etc., Karlsruhe, 1831, pages 226 to 228. Those were the footnotes. The state of somnambulism is one, says Colquhoun, totally different from that of ordinary life, a state in which the animal sensibility undergoes an essential change, a state in which the ordinary activity of the corporeal faculties is suspended for a time, and the internal instinct, the immaterial principle, perhaps the soul itself, displays its unfettered energies independently of the material organs, a state of existence which has been almost prophetically, although unintentionally, described in the following beautiful lines of one of the most philosophical of our living poets: a state in which the burthen of the mystery, in which the heavy and the weary weight of all this unintelligible world is lightened, that serene and blessed state in which the affections gently lead us on, until the breath of this corporeal frame, and even the motion of our human blood almost suspended, we are laid asleep in body and become a living soul, while with an eye made quiet by the power of harmony and the deep power of joy, we see into the life of things. Wordsworth, lines on revisiting The Banks of the Wye, one of the finest pieces of blank verse in the English language. It cannot fail, I think, to be perceived with what remarkable, what wonderfully minute accuracy this poetical description tallies with the phenomena which actually occur in the magnetic somnambulism. In that state, we appear to forget all knowledge of our previous existence. The burthen of the mystery, the heavy and the weary weight of all this unintelligible world is lightened. The ordinary functions of the animal organization are suspended. We are laid asleep in body. The mind becomes divested of the ordinary cares and anxieties of the world, and is usually composed, serene, and cheerful, while the intellectual faculties, free and unfettered, are exercised with an extraordinary degree of vigor and acuteness. We become a living soul. At the same time, the eye of the mind, the internal power of vision, is wonderfully strengthened and enlarged, and seems unconfined within the narrow limits of space and time. We do not see objects in a merely superficial manner. We penetrate beyond external nature. We see into the life of things. It must be quite evident that the phenomena of such a state of existence as that described cannot be explained by the laws and conditions of ordinary life. The physiological principles which are applicable in the one case are totally inapplicable in the other. Yet every system of human physiology which declines to investigate these facts upon their own appropriate principles must necessarily be imperfect. Indeed, an impartial and attentive study of the phenomena of somnambulism cannot fail to lead us to conclusions highly interesting to the philosophy of man. A certain class of philosophers, says Colhoun, deeply impressed with the mysterious intimations and manifestations of our spiritual nature, in contradistinction to those of the mere sensible organization, have been led, independently of revelation, to assume a twofold world, a sensible and a supersensible, a twofold life in man, the phenomenal and the noumenal, the one adapted to our condition and the circumstances by which we are surrounded in the present state of our existence, the other manifesting within us a more spiritual character and rendering us capable of anticipating and enjoying the prospect of a future. The poets, too, yielding to the impulse of these lofty aspirations, have frequently appealed with rapt inspiration to the higher principles of our being, in their glowing ideal representations of the dignity of that spiritual nature which was infused into man at the creation. The discoveries of animal magnetism have at length demonstrated that in all this there is something more than mere metaphysical hypothesis or poetical rhapsody. They have experimentally proved that there is something more elevated in the nature of man than appears to common observation in the ordinary state of our existence, and from the interesting and consolatory truths they have unfolded, there has been developed, as the flower from the bud, that delightful faith in the expansive and imperishable character of our spiritual being, which, while it exalts us beyond the narrow limits of time and space, and teaches us to aspire to a brighter, a purer, and a loftier destiny, seems calculated ultimately to produce an eternal reconciliation and harmonious concord between religion and philosophy. With regard to the bygone fortunes of animal magnetism, says Colhoun, the first report of the French academicians in 1784 threw a degree of doubt and ridicule over the whole inquiry, which the subsequent efforts of many learned men eager to refute or to condemn, yet unwilling to investigate, naturally tended to augment rather than to dispel. They would not grant the new doctrine even the privilege of a fair hearing. It has been observed by Lord Bacon that when a doubt is once received, men labor rather how to keep it a doubt still, and accordingly bend their wits. But, says his lordship, that use of wit and knowledge is to be allowed which laboureth to make doubtful things certain, and not those which labour to make certain things doubtful. More than half a century has now elapsed since the report in question was drawn up and presented to the public, and during that period many learned and eminent individuals have, by experimental investigation, fully demonstrated the reality of the disputed facts, and thrown much light on the principles upon which they probably depend. The truth of the doctrines of animal magnetism, therefore, must be determined not by the points of view in which they presented themselves to the French commissioners in 1784, but according to the more matured form they have since been made to assume by the assiduous labors of subsequent inquiries. For my own part, a humble laborer in the vineyard of science, I should be happy to think that I had been in any degree instrumental in diffusing a knowledge of these important but neglected truths, or at least in promoting and facilitating the investigation. I desire not a blind belief, but an impartial examination and a rational conviction. In short, all that I now ask or have ever asked for animal magnetism is what I presume no person of intelligence and candor can refuse me: a fair field and no favor. Hoc unum gestit, ne ignorata damnetur. It may be, with truth asserted, that the merits of the controversy between the animal magnetists and their opponents of all descriptions must be considered as having been long since determined in the eyes of all enlightened and rational men. On the one side, we have a vast number of curious and incontrovertible facts abundantly attested by competent and credible witnesses, and supported by many natural analogies. On the other, we meet with nothing but ignorant ridicule, willfully blind, perverse, and invincible prejudices, or with ingenious but empty opinions, arguments, and speculations inconsistent with these facts and analogies. The contest lies entirely between fact and theory or preconception, and no rational mind can hesitate for a moment, after adequate inquiry, to determine on which side the truth is to be found. Indeed, it may happen here, as in other cases, that, in the words of Bacon, the voice of nature will consent whether the voice of man do or not. By those, indeed, who have thoroughly investigated the subject with attention, discrimination, and impartiality, the doctrine of animal magnetism is now considered as a real, an important, and an imperishable acquisition. There are few truths which have been ultimately evolved under more unfavorable circumstances. It has already withstood the severest trials, time, scientific opposition in an enlightened age, persecution, misrepresentation, sophistry, contempt, ridicule, even the desolating tempests of political revolution. If the victory has been at length achieved upon the continent, we owe a debt of gratitude to those honest, those persevering, and indefatigable men who, having once been fortunate enough to seize upon the truth, held it fast for a time, until at last they were enabled to carry it triumphantly into the very camp of the scorner. But in order to render the ultimate triumph of truth fully available to humanity, it is necessary that philosophers and enlightened physicians should at length abandon that irrational state of opposition or indifference in which they have hitherto sought to entrench themselves, that they should restrain that supercilious skepticism with which they have long been accustomed to regard the phenomena, that they should condescend to investigate the facts carefully, rigorously, and impartially, that when their researches have produced conviction, they should endeavor to wrest the magnetic treatment out of the hands of the unskillful empiric, take it into their own management, and exercise it for the benefit of mankind. Should medical men spurn this advice, I do not hesitate to maintain that they willfully neglect one of the most important duties of their profession, deprive themselves of a large sphere of usefulness, and render themselves guilty of no slight offense against the interests of society. Let them remember, as Lord Bacon has justly observed, that the science of medicine, if it be destituted and forsaken by natural philosophy, is not much better than an empirical practice. To the philosopher, I would repeat the suggestion of the venerable Monsieur Deleuze in his admirable defense of this doctrine against the attacks of Monsieur Viry. Animal magnetism is a natural cause which explains all the effects formerly attributed to magic and witchcraft, as electricity explains the thunder, as astronomy explains the appearance of comets, as a knowledge of the different laws of nature explains all those phenomena which in times of ignorance were ascribed to supernatural agents. The opinion that an emanation from one person directed by his will may act upon another individual, as an emanation from the brain acts upon the fingers, does not conduct us to the belief of the action of devils. On the contrary, it annihilates this superstition, by teaching us to see in ourselves the cause of many effects which were formerly ascribed to strange and chimerical powers. And here's a footnote. In this view, animal magnetism might perhaps be not inaptly considered as the philosophy of superstition, its object being to investigate the natural causes of many of those phenomena which have hitherto been entirely disbelieved against positive evidence of their reality, or held to be the effects of supernatural agency. To the divine, I would humbly submit that the doctrine of animal magnetism does in no degree interfere with our belief in real miracles, because it does not prevent us from believing that the omnipotent author of nature may, if and when he pleases, interrupt or suspend the ordinary laws of nature. But this doctrine does tend to prevent us from believing in false and pretended miracles, by demonstrating that the facts which appeared miraculous before magnetism became known, are only the effects of a faculty natural to man. The real tendency of animal magnetism, therefore, is to give a powerful, although an indirect, support to true religion by overthrowing one prevalent species of superstition. For, as Saint Cyprian has said, superstitionibus falsis religio vera subvertitur. To the philosopher, the physician, and the divine, I would strongly recommend the study of the proofs afforded by animal magnetism of the immateriality, independence, and immortality of the human soul. Before I conclude, I must beg leave to be permitted to add a few words of solemn warning. In attempting to produce the magnetic phenomena, I would earnestly caution individuals against all experiments of mere curiosity. Whatever ludicrous ideas many persons may have been hitherto in the habit of associating with this subject, I can seriously assure them that experience has proved magnetism to be no trifling matter. Even the opponents of the system acknowledge, whilst its advocates admit, that the injudicious practice of it may be attended with dangerous consequences. We must not recklessly attempt to handle the thunderbolt or to play with the lightning of heaven, lest we be consumed to ashes. Like every higher gift conferred upon us by the Creator, the magnetic faculty ought to be exerted with judgment, prudence, and discretion, and only for benevolent purposes. We do not know, says the great Dr. Hufland in his Journal der Heilkunde, we do not know either the essence or the limits of this astonishing power, but everything proves that it penetrates the depths of the organism and the internal life of the nervous system, that it may even affect the mind itself and disturb its ordinary relations. Whoever then undertakes to govern and direct this mysterious power attempts a very bold task. Let him consider well that he is probably penetrating, as far as is possible, into the most elevated laws of nature. Never let him enter this sanctuary without reverential fear, and without the most profound respect for the principle which he endeavors to set in operation. Above all, let him beware of magnetizing in sport. In medicine, the most indifferent remedy is injurious to persons in health. Still more so an agent which is perhaps the most active and energetic of all remedies. For these reasons, while the unquestionable phenomena of animal magnetism suggest to the philosopher the most interesting topics of scientific investigation, it has always been the wish of every intelligent magnetist that the remedial practice of the art should be consigned entirely into the hands of the professional physician. Upon the continent, this object seems to have been already nearly accomplished. In this country, on the contrary, the profession in general appear to look upon the whole subject with the most profound apathetic indifference, out of which it is probable they will only be eventually aroused in self-defense by the superior intelligence of the public. From all the cases of the natural somnambulism referred to in the preceding chapters, looking to the phenomena which are found to occur in all, or at least in the greater number of instances, I think we are fully entitled to deduce the following conclusions. In general, the somnambulist, apparently without the use of any of the organs of external sensibility, sees and distinguishes objects as distinctly as when awake, and in his ordinary state. He moves about by day or night with equal, if not with superior, confidence and security, carefully avoiding all obstacles that may happen to stand in his way. He performs acts while under the influence of this affection, of which he is totally incapable when awake, and fearlessly exposes himself to dangers which he would otherwise shrink from with terror. He reads, writes, sings, plays, thinks, reflects, reasons, and performs a variety of the most delicate operations, whether intellectual or mechanical, not only as if he had the complete use of all his senses, but as if the power, acuteness, and delicacy of his faculties were actually increased in consequence of being emancipated from their organic thraldom. In almost all of these cases, we are assured that the eyes of the somnambulists were either exactly closed or open and staring, and destitute of sensibility, and from the decisive experiments that were made in several instances, it appears to be clearly made out that the faculty of sight neither was, nor could possibly have been, exercised through the medium of the usual organ of vision. All the other senses, too, are frequently found in a dormant or suspended state, as appears in a variety of cases, and this fact would probably have been rendered still more prominent in these and other instances had the proper experiments been made with a view to ascertain its existence. Somnambulists, it also appears, are capable of answering distinctly any questions that may be put to them, and occasionally of carrying on a rational conversation. Indeed, their intellectual faculties, while in that state, seem to possess much more than their usual clearness and energy. It has been likewise observed that individuals well under this affection occasionally manifest a superior knowledge of subjects and of languages which they had not previously studied so as to remember, or with which they had been but imperfectly acquainted. One of the most remarkably characteristic circumstances attending this singular state of existence, and which is invariably found to accompany the perfect crisis, is that on awakening the individual who had thus, as it were, insensibly performed all these operations, retains no recollection of anything that occurred while he was under the influence of the paroxysm. The same individual, when awake and when somnambulist, appears like two entirely different persons. As matter of history, and with a view to assist us in our investigations into this very curious subject, I may here be permitted to advert to some of those theories which have been propounded by certain ingenious men in order to account for the extraordinary phenomena of somnambulism. I observed in a former chapter that it is through the medium of the nerves that the vital principle appears to be acted upon, that they are the sources of the animal affectability, that many eminent physicians and physiologists had found themselves compelled to assume the existence of a nervous fluid as the vehicle of the influence in question, and that the existence of this fluid, if not actually demonstrated, had at least been rendered exceedingly probable by the researches of several celebrated experimental philosophers. Now, the existence of this nervous or vital fluid lies at the bottom of almost all the theories of animal magnetism. Of Mesmer I have already spoken. The following are the fundamental opinions upon this subject of Monsieur Tardy du Montrevel, an early, practical, and most intelligent disciple of magnetism. There exists a fluid diffused throughout all nature, which is the principle of life and motion. This fluid, in traversing bodies, modifies them, and is modified by them in its turn. When it circulates from one body to another with the same motion, these two bodies are in harmony with each other. It is by means of this fluid that our nerves receive sensations. Besides the external organs of the senses, man possesses an internal sense of which the entire nervous system is the organ, and the principal seat is in the plexus solaris. This sixth sense is the principle of what we call instinct in animals. If, by any cause whatever, the external senses are deadened, and the internal organ of sensibility acquires more irritability, the latter alone performs the functions of all the others. It carries to the soul the most delicate impressions, and these impressions affect us in a lively manner, because our attention is no longer distracted by other objects. This is what takes place in somnambulism. With regard to previsions, they are entirely the result of the combinations of the intellect, which reasons according to the impressions it experiences, as a watchmaker foresees the instant when a pendulum will stop, as an astronomer foresees the various motions which will take place in the heavens. In animals, instinct is purely mechanical. In man, it is augmented by all the moral faculties, and it is for this reason that it sometimes becomes the expression of conscience. The knowledge which the somnambulist possesses of distant objects is owing to this fluid, which conveys to him the impression of them traversing all bodies as light traverses glass. A theory similar to the preceding is adopted by Monsieur Deleuze in his Histoire critique du magnétisme animal. Indeed, it appears in one form or another in the works of almost all writers upon the subject. The fluid in question is supposed to be analogous to electricity and galvanism. Both are thought to depend upon the same principle and to have one common origin, and a very ingenious recent author has ascribed all the important phenomena of nature to the various combinations of this universal fluid with matter. I am perfectly aware that in the present state of gross ignorance upon the subject it would be equally foolish and futile to enlarge upon any such theory as that now briefly touched upon in this country. The facts themselves, which have given birth to this theory, must first be more generally studied, appreciated, and admitted, before we can expect that any great attention will be paid to the principles upon which they are capable of being explained. That there are still difficulties to be surmounted before the truths of mesmerism are universally acknowledged, we do not attempt to conceal. The nature of these has been excellently described by Fourcroy, the celebrated chemist, in the following passage. The cold inactivity of some, the affected indifference of others, the contempt expressed by one person, the irritated self-love, and the languid attachment of another for the doctrine of his ancestors, the dread of novelty and prejudices of every kind, all the mean passions which, gliding into society and playing their parts in civil life, are also to be met with in the sciences, the sarcasms and epigrams with which they arm conversation, all these retard for a short time, perhaps for some years, the progress of new ideas. But truth ultimately overcomes every obstacle. Neither the clamors of envy, nor the resistance of prejudice, nor the opposition of ignorance can terrify it. It is the rock against which the impotent waves of human passion are broken. When the vivid light of truth strikes those minds that are properly adapted to feel its influence, it soon inspires them with a sufficient degree of force to make them proclaim it with confidence, and to establish its rights on a solid foundation. Mesmerism, like other truths which were first doubted, then decried, and finally adopted, will ultimately have its day of triumph. And that is almost the end of the book. A very passionate final chapter there. Next up is going to be The Supplement by the Reverend Chauncey Hare Townshend, who was one of the main proponents of mesmerism at this time in the 1830s and 1840s. He helped make it very popular. This book might not exist without him, so next time we'll hear what he has to say. It doesn't look like a long supplement, but the font, for some reason, is like half as big, and it's very dense text, so it'll probably be another hour or so long episode, but we'll look forward to hear what the Reverend Townshend has to say. And with that, I'm signing off for tonight. See you next time.